Hey yo, I know you heard of Spotify, right? It's free to download, and your girl's on there. That's right. So download, search the CRISPUS podcast with Aquila, and hit follow. It's that simple. Hello, and welcome back to The Conversation Piece with your host, Aquila. Happy Black History Month. It's your girl Aquila, and I am doing a special project, a little special Black History project. I've chosen some names at random, but they kind of weirdly group together. You'll see once I'm all finished, but I'll be sharing some journal entries. I'll be doing something a little... Just feel my vibe on this whole thing, okay? Alright, buckle up. Let's go. So again, why am I doing profiles on Black people during Black History Month? Duh. No, kidding. Because I feel it's my duty to not only educate myself, but my nieces and nephews, for they're not being taught about themselves in school, especially in Florida, where the governor seems to think it lacks educational value. And if they do get taught Black history, it's the likes of Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, W. Du Bois, the usual cast. And there's nothing wrong with that. But Black people in America, our roots in this country are deep. And they go way back, as you'll see. We're living in a time where DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusive programs, are being systematically stripped away in education and employment. Because, check this out, the critics suggest that such programs provide means for marginalized groups, such as minorities and women, people of color, gay people, to be viewed and treated differently. And tax dollars should not be provided for such programs. Okay, reality check. Why did DEI, or affirmative action, need to be introduced in the first place? Because y'all weren't hiring Black people, gay people, women, people of color. And let's keep it G. Straight white men, you guys have a form of affirmative action. They're called legacy clubs. They're called golf clubs. You get my drift. There was no one in the room to speak that language. I will speak the language. I will tell the stories, mention names, and personalize the faces of Black men and women whose contributions to this country deserve far more credit than just a month in February. So, regardless of whether critics want to diminish it, hide it, or just erase it from the books entirely, you will find that you can't run from the truth. The truth always has a way of revealing its light.
I was wondering about our yesterdays and digging through the rubble. And to say the least, somebody went to a hell of a lot of trouble to make sure that when we looked things up, we wouldn't fare too well. And we would come up with totally unreliable pictures of ourselves. But I've compiled what few facts I could, such as they are, to see if we could find out a little bit of something. And this is what I got so far. First, white folks discovered Africa. They claimed it fair and square. Cecil Rhodes couldn't have been robbing nobody because, hell, there wasn't nobody there. And white folks brought all the civilization because there wasn't none around. How could the folks be civilized when wasn't nobody writing nothing down? And just to prove all of their suspicions, well, didn't take too long. They found out that there were whole tribes of people in plain sight running around with no clothes on. That's right. The men, the women, the young, and the old righteous folks covered their eyes, and no time was spent considering the environment. Hell no, this just wasn't civilized. And another piece of information they had, or at least this is what we were taught, is that unlike the civilized people of Europe, these tribal units actually fought. And yes, there was some crude implements, and yes, there was primitive art, and yes, they were masters of hunting and fishing, and courtesy came from the heart. And yes, there was love and medicine, religion, intertribal communication by drum, but no paper, no pencils, and no other utensils, and hell, these folks never even heard of a gun. And this is why the colonies came, to stabilize the land, because the dark continent had copper and gold, and the discoverers had themselves a plan. They would discover all the places with promise. You didn't need no titles and deeds. Then they would appoint people to make everything legal, to sanction the trickery and greed. And back in the jungle, when the natives got restless, they would call it guerrilla attack. And they would never describe that the folks finally got wise and decided that they would fight back. And still, we are victims of word games. Semantics is always a bitch. Places once referred to as underdeveloped are now called mineral rich. And the game goes on eternally. Unity kept just beyond reach. Egypt and Libya used to be in Africa. They've now been moved to the Middle East. There are examples galore, I assure you. But if interpreting were left up to me, I'd be sure every time folks knew this version wasn't mine, which is why it is called his story.
Psst. Psst, psst. What do Spotify, Google Podcast, iHeartRadio, RadioPublic.com, and Pocket Cast all have in common? Me, the Conversation Piece podcast with Aquila. So go ahead and hit that notification button. Go ahead. I'll wait. Alright, back to the show. For some people, the lack of mention of the contributions of patriotism by Black people in this country lends some to believe that Black people don't have an attachment or love for the United States of America. That is far from factual. In fact, without the pressure from Black people pushing for their civil and human rights, primarily in a diplomatic form, what would America's democracy look like today? Would America even be a democracy? Remember, we were once a British colony and paid taxes to the English Empire. And in the town of Boston, the Redcoats were occupying the city to tamp down on some of the unrest resulting from frustration over the Townshend duties, which was a tax paid to the English treasury. This overtaxing led to frustration and riots erupted. People in New England were like, yo, the British about to catch these hands, and dump tea in the harbor. This would eventually lead to the Boston Massacre, in which a Black man, CRISPUS ATTUCKS, is the first casualty as British Redcoats shot CRISPUS twice in the chest. He died on March 5th, 1770. For his death, he is honored as a symbol of heroism in the American Revolution. Let's not look at his death, but who he was as a person and how he lived his life. For less than 100 years later, another war would begin, the Civil War, a war that nearly ripped the nation apart. But in 1770, it was a Black man that put his life and freedom on the line for a nation where some were still questioning the humanity of his race. Researching people from the 18th century and beyond can be challenging. What is known about CRISPUS is that he was of mixed heritage, African American and American Indian, and was a former slave who escaped enslavement at 27 under the rumored alias of Michael Johnson. After escaping, he found work as a sailor, which was one of the few jobs that employed non-white people. Another interesting fact and twist involves two figures, Attucks himself and former President John Adams. John Adams served as a defense attorney for the soldiers who shot and killed CRISPUS, and used Attucks' physical stature as a justification for the soldiers' fear of him. See, Attucks was a tall man. Some report him as 6'2", other sources have him 6 inches taller than the average American man at that time. Crispus was also known for being quite a handsome man, but according to the trial transcript, Adams stated, a stout mulatto fellow, whose very looks was enough to terrify any person. Was he terrifying? Or was he just trying to survive? Being a seaman and one of the few jobs that provided employment for non-white workers, Crispus now found himself in competition with British soldiers who had to supplement their income because their wages were so low. This sentiment of competition with the occupying redcoats made not just Crispus, but others in town culminate a growing resentment and hatred toward the British. The British were also forcibly drawing soldiers into their Royal Navy, and Crispus could not afford being arrested, captured. While drinking one night in a pub, a British soldier wandered in and inquired about part-time employment. The anger grew, and the locals in the pub harassed the soldier until he left. According to testimony, a mob went and confronted the soldiers, Attucks among them. And according to historian Doug R. Egerton, this act on Crispus' part took bravery because, quote, the prudent thing to do for a man like Attucks was to back away from that confrontation, but he did not. Crispus was a runaway enslaved man, and he could not risk being arrested and return back to being enslaved. The night of the massacre, armed with 2 wooden sticks, Crispus was at the front of the crowd. He gave one stick to Patrick Heaton. The other found its way to Captain Thomas Preston. According to witness accounts, Crispus grabbed a soldier's bayonet and yelled to the crowd to soldier on. Kill the dogs! Knock them over! Then the soldier regained control of the bayonet and fired, striking him in the chest. 5 people, Attucks among them, died. The soldiers were acquitted of the murder, but 2 soldiers were found guilty of manslaughter. After being branded on their hands, they were eventually released. Crispus is seen as a martyr in the American Revolution, and his funeral was befitting of one at that time. No non-white person received honors in death like this. One of the founding fathers, political activist, Sons of Liberty founder Samuel Adams, organized for a procession for Attucks' casket to Boston's Faneuil Hill. It lay in state for 3 days. When it was time for the public burial, more than half of Boston's population joined in the procession of his casket that made its way to the gravesite. His story is not finished, for little is known of this brief snapshot into his life. His legacy lives on. He is a symbol of patriotism in the highest regard. From an enslaved man who broke away to his freedom, who found a way onto a vessel as a sailor, who knew his worth as a man needed to be fought for against any occupying force that seemed to want more. He fought for himself, and even though a political ideology wasn't his goal or intention, it spurred the nation to fight against their oppressor, even if it was in the form of taxes. Oppression in any form is still oppression. Martin Luther King wrote in 1964 that black children, quote, know that the first American to shed blood in a revolution that freed his country from British oppression was a black seaman named Crispus Attucks. Thank you again for tuning in to another episode of the Conversation Piece podcast. I am your humble host, Aquila, requesting that you join me again. So, until then, be safe, love, and value yourself so that you can love and value others. I bid you adieu with the greeting, Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you.